There's an old proverb I'm very fond of that says that one day a man and the devil were taking a long walk together, and as they walked, the man discovered an important truth, and he showed it to the devil, and Satan said, "Here, let me organize that for you." There is something about institutionalizing truth, even a wonderful truth, that can take all the good right out of it. We get used to expecting politicians to be dishonest and self-serving. We regrettably accept that corporations and the wealthy will manipulate the banking and the tax system and insurance companies to serve their own interests. We may even become wary of friendships and love relationships that come and go far too easily. But when it comes to the church, that vessel that has carried the gospel through the centuries, it never seems right to just tacitly accept corruption when you find it there. It seems when you find corruption within organized religion that it's more malevolent, it's more malignant, it's more insidious, it's more disappointing, it's more heartbreaking because it's so out of place. It's one of the things that you have to love about the Gospels in the New Testament. That the Bible, might scare some people to hear me say it, but the Bible wasn't written by God. It wasn't written by Jesus. It wasn't written even by the apostles who knew Jesus. The Gospels are a product of the early faith community 3 or 4 generations after the major players were all dead. It was preserved by the church. It was edited by priests and pastors. And yet, as we find in our reading from Matthew this morning, in spite of all that editing and all those generations of separation, you still have a saying that is just Jesus throwing a rock right at the church, specifically at pompous bishops, priests, and pastors who run it. You would have thought they would have edited that out, but somehow here and there, a little echo of what Jesus would have actually said makes it through all the layers of editing. There really isn't much preserved of the teachings of the historical Jesus, especially considering how much there ought to be for as important as he has been in the development of human history. But of all that got left out, of all that got edited out and suppressed and hidden, covered up by later church tradition, it is shocking that Matthew was able to keep this one stinging rebuke of the clergy in the gospel. Now, it's referring to scribes and Pharisees, but of course, scribes and Pharisees are not reading this text. This is a text talking about priests and pastors. It's a helpful reminder for us in this age to be sure that we realize that the gospel and the church are not the same thing. As important as the church was as a social institution, I've always wondered if Jesus would have ever bothered to go to one if there had been one in his day. The primary preaching theme of Jesus, if you just read through the 4 Gospels without even editing out what we think is later tradition or what might hail back to Jesus, if you just read what Jesus said, take out all the narrative and miracles, what did he say? What did he talk about? He talked about the kingdom of God. That was the primary preaching theme of Jesus. The rule of God. Kingdom doesn't always echo well in our ears. We don't live in a kingdom. We don't know much about one. But the rule of God, the government of God, the institution of the will of God in the actual living of history. And in that government, in that kingdom, in that empire, people don't kill other people. People don't steal. People don't lie. In that kingdom, there is no poverty. There is no hunger. That's the kingdom that Jesus talked about. And that's the kingdom that Jesus said was coming, and that is probably the biggest mistake he made, because that kingdom hasn't come. He didn't get the kingdom. He got the church. Is it any wonder he hasn't come back? I mean, he said he was going to come back. He doesn't really have a kingdom to come back to. He's got the church, and that just doesn't look that attractive, maybe. The church has been the vessel of the message of Jesus. The church, however, codified the gospel, ritualized it, and in many ways sanitized it, pulled its teeth. But at least it preserved a way of thinking and a vision of a better world. Even while often lending support to governments, dictators, economies that were the exact opposite of what Jesus envisioned, at least they preserved some of the message and the document. But the church has been a vital institution for hundreds of years. There was hardly a crossroad in America that didn't sprout one or two churches. If you drive, as I oftentimes have reason to do, through the Corn Belt of Iowa, Indiana, Illinois, Kentucky, even where there's hardly a tree to break the horizon, where you can see where two streets cross, there's usually two steeples. There's two groups of farmers, 12, 14 in each church, that can't get along well enough to meet under one steeple. Our downtown cityscapes, and you go to Montreal, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, you go to the downtown of any major American city, and the skyline is punctuated by cathedrals and steeples. But the dominance of the church has gone the way of the wooden slide rule and the manual typewriter. Churches all over America are doing exactly what they did in Europe. They're either closing down or they're being repurposed. Many cathedrals that you will run into in Ireland or Scotland or in France or in Denmark have become shopping malls and office buildings. They maintain a lot of the beauty of the architecture that lets you know that 100 years ago they were vital congregations, but they're not anymore. 20 years ago, on a Sunday morning, I preached to between 300 and 400 people who crowded into two services in a highly ornate sanctuary. And in those days, when I was preaching to 300 and 400 people on Sunday mornings, we had 20 to 40 people who subscribed to a cassette service that got a mailed audio version of that morning's sermon. There might have been 300 or 400 people who read my essays either in the newspaper or in a church newsletter. But now, 2014, we see 40 or 50 people here gathered in our very simple little church, while somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 people will download our messages from iTunes or YouTube every month. So the total number of people that I'm talking to has gone up by 1,000% over the years, and yet the number of people that I get to see and talk to has shrunk by 75%. I have tried in vain to make a substantive connection to our far-flung audience that listens to us on the internet. I've struggled somehow to reach out to them to make them a part of our community. But the world has changed. The world is just different than it used to be. People don't connect the way they once did. And there's lots of sociological books and articles on this topic, like bowling alone, that there are more people bowling than ever bowled before, even if you might have Ebola. Apparently going bowling is still vital. But more people are bowling, but fewer people are joining bowling teams, that there's fewer and fewer people willing to be organized into anything. People don't connect that way. So I have a very substantive fear that bricks and mortar churches will only exist in symbolic ways 20 years from now. But even still, you have to see that the church is not the gospel. They're not the same thing. our church, this congregation, never bothered to affiliate with a denomination. We talked about it. I served Disciples of Christ churches for nearly 30 years. And there was a time when I was a puppy preacher when I looked up to my denominational leaders with admiration and with confidence. There were times when I faced a challenging or difficult situation that I would pick up the phone and confidently call a regional minister or an area minister to ask for their advice and counsel, to ask for resources. But as the institutional church shrank and jobs became more scarce, that when I moved to Missouri in 1991, our regional staff was about 20 people. Now it's 5. And as jobs were being ended, you saw a rise of what I call Machiavellian church politics. That is, how can I mess you up enough so that you're the one who loses your job and I get to keep mine? Dishonesty and backstabbing became the rule of the day, and I have written several letters to judicatories to say the mafia could learn lessons from you about how to undermine your competition and keep your own job. In place of the self-sacrificing servants of the church that I think I remember, the few remaining judicatories seemed to be willing to be as dishonest and corrupt as they had to be sure that their pensions and their salaries remained untouched. One example was the Division of Higher Education in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. They, at one time, had campus ministers not only on disciple-related colleges, but a lot of state universities. And they placed chaplains around the country, and it was a huge form of employment for ministers involved in campus ministry. But as resources got smaller and smaller, they kept laying off and not paying for staff, and they would offer some small scholarships. And then even that ended. It ended up with the president of the Division of Higher Education, who didn't even have a secretary or a staff, but he still had a 6-figure salary with no program, no one working for him, and nothing to supervise, but he still had a job. That he had managed to keep a very high-paying job, pulling down resources that could have at least been used for education in some way, that went for a job. My relationship with the Disciples of Christ did not end initially just when I reported the former general minister and president of our denomination, C. William Nichols, of pedophilia and of using church funds for illicit sex. I did do that, and that burned a lot of bridges, but I remained in the Disciples. I reported it, trusting the church to deal with it appropriately. They asked me what I thought should be done. I said, you should call the police. There should be criminal prosecution immediately. But the general board of the denomination decided instead to pay $60,000 to each of his victims if they would keep quiet about it. And they got them to sign a non-disparagement agreement, silence, where they could never mention it. They, however, forgot to ask me to sign the document, and that's why I'm willing to use names and talk about it in public. They paid off the living victims, and they swept it under the rug and kept it quiet until Nichols passed away naturally. Closer to home, about a decade ago, I demanded an audit of our local Ozarks Lakes area office because it became apparent to me that designated monies, like if you give money to a nonprofit organization, as I did, to start a Hispanic ministry, and then they never start a Hispanic ministry, but that line item disappears, that could be, under the best circumstances, malfeasance if you just mismanaged money. But when I pointed it out in board meetings as a board member that the money was going missing and they refused to do anything about it, I'm not a lawyer, but I think that then becomes embezzling. So I reported embezzlement of more than $250,000. And no investigation was ever conducted, no criminal charges were filed, and the person responsible, Mike Weinman, is still an area minister in the Disciples of Christ. I cannot believe that he's not in prison. I truly can't believe he's not in prison. And you may think it's bold of me to use his name and make this allegation in public, but the greatest defense you can use, even in our corrupt judicial system, is the truth. And so they'll never take action against me for saying it because it's true, and they know it's true. And yet, what I find even more fascinating is that there were dozens of disciple pastors in this area who knew it was going on and refused to say anything about it. Just let it happen. And so the hypocrisy within the institutional church could give you motivation to say, I don't trust them and I give up. What I want to say today is very similar to what Jesus evidently said. They sit in Moses' seat, but don't do what they do. Their hypocrisy is not an excuse for our indifference. Because you can list the offenses of other people is no reason for you to give yourself an excuse to become morally neutral or not a moral player. I did my master's thesis in the treatment of addiction. So I worked as a therapist in the Veterans Hospital, and I went to AA meetings probably 5 nights a week for 3 or 4 years. And it was one of the most common things you would hear when someone was coming. A lot of people go to AA because they've been court ordered to go. They've had enough DUIs that the judge says, guess who gets to go to meetings now? And you would hear them describing people they knew who drank more than they did and who had more car accidents than they did, which was to say, I'm not nearly as bad as them, and therefore I don't have to come to terms with my own addiction. I don't have to come to terms with my own crimes. That's not really an applicable excuse. In philosophy, it's called an argument from ad hominem. It's saying other people are worse than me, therefore I'm okay. That really doesn't work. The institutional church is dying. It's dying under the weight of bureaucratic corruption and of financial starvation. They have made themselves morally irrelevant. At one point, I actually drove to Tulsa to visit with the former regional minister of the Disciples of Christ, Steve Cranford, and I said, I feel like we should identify with a larger body, that we as a congregation should be a part of the institution. And Steve just looked at me and said, why? What would it do for you? How could it do anything except drain resources and expose you to vulnerability? I want to believe that it's not impossible for churches to regain moral relevance. I want to believe that this new pope is the real deal. I have been careful not to fall into Pope Francis euphoria because I've been fooled before. I hope that the reforms that he is hinting at will actually take root. But whether they do or whether they don't, the Catholic Church is at least a half a century behind the inevitable changes of society. And though they have the numbers and the money to survive for another century, they will shed numbers at a rate that will look very much like a free fall. You cannot move into the 21st century still saying that you have to be male to be ordained and that homosexuality is a sin when at least 80% of your clergy are homosexuals and hope to have a future. That kind of hypocrisy is not sustainable. Smaller Protestant denominations will either merge with one another or they will simply blink out of existence. And so far as I'm concerned, they won't disappear fast enough to suit me. They were useful at one time, but I think they have by and large become too sick to be redeemed. They need to get out of the way and make room for something else to emerge. I wish I knew what the something else was, but they need to get out of the way and stop sucking the air out of the room and let something else come up. The institutional church is somewhere between the intensive care unit and the morgue, but the gospel is still alive. Where it will take root is not at all clear to me. Though we have 10 times as many listeners online as we have in the room, fair to say we have 100 times as many listeners as we have people in the room. I still don't think that faith will be sustained on iTunes and YouTube. I don't think it's enough. Somehow people of faith still have to find each other, have to get to know each other, have to network, have to become a part of a community. You can sit in front of your computer and watch a sermon, but that doesn't get you to join a group of people that's actually going to go out and drive voters to the polls, or prepare a meal and take it to the homeless shelter, or to stand up and protest anti-immigrant policies in your own city government. If we don't build community, the message itself has no legs. Now, Bishop Spong has pointed directly at our little church and declared that we are an example of what the church must become. I find that validating and encouraging, but like the 2,000 people who are going to download this message on the web, Bishop Spong lives 1,000 miles away. And even though he and Christine have donated to our church very generously, it remains to be seen if even our wild and rebellious version of the church can survive. But folks, you have to realize that the kingdom that Jesus talked about still hasn't come. The military-industrial complex still will have more power on Wednesday morning than the people that were just elected to Congress and the Senate. Our corporate media still tries to distract us as if we all had the intelligence of preschool children. And poverty, which could have been stamped out by now. Our country has the resources to have ended poverty, but poverty is actually increasing rather than decreasing. The denominational church may and probably will and probably should die. The whole business of religious institutions being against other religious institutions may have served a purpose in previous centuries, but it's threatening to kill us now. There is no need to have a church or a religious body that thinks that Christianity is right and Buddhism is wrong. We need faith communities that believe that peace and justice are right and warfare and injustice are wrong. It's not about communion, baptism, praying 5 times while facing Mecca, or putting food offerings and incense in front of a statue. It's about paying a living wage to workers. It's about treating people with respect and affording fundamental human rights to minorities, regardless of their gender, their race, their sexual orientation, or their nation of origin. There are big issues in life waiting for our time, our attention, and our resources. Religious turf battles need to be relegated to the pages of history, and the sooner the better.
You have been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at Rev. Dr. Ray at AOL.com for more information.